The lookout on the Titanic shouted, "Iceberg, right ahead." The ship had struck the iceberg, and soon after, icy seawater began flooding into the lower compartments of the Titanic. Panic quickly set in as the third-class passengers were trapped below deck. Adding to the chaos, it became increasingly clear that there were not enough lifeboats to save everyone on board. In those desperate moments, violins played while passengers scrambled for their lives. The Titanic would sink, sealing its fate in one of the most famous maritime disasters in history. This iconic scene is familiar to most of us through the blockbuster movie Titanic, a film that etched itself into our collective memory. However, while the movie may have given us a riveting spectacle, it didn't tell the whole truth. To uncover the real story of what happened on that freezing night in 1912, we need to dig deeper into the facts, because Hollywood didn't exactly get everything right. One of the details the movie captured accurately was the fateful warning, "Iceberg, right ahead." This cry came just before 11:40 p.m., when lookout Frederick Fleet spotted something darker than the sea ahead. Initially, it was difficult to make out, but as the ship got closer, it became apparent that an iceberg was directly in the Titanic's path. The crew sprang into action, quickly reversing the engines and turning the ship sharply to avoid a head-on collision. Instead of crashing headlong into the iceberg, Titanic scraped along the side, dislodging chunks of ice onto the forward deck. If you recall the film, this is when Jack and Rose feel the ship shudder, as though an earthquake had struck. The whole ship trembles under the impact, shaking the passengers. However, real-life survivor Frank Prentice, who was aboard that night, described the incident in much more subdued terms. According to Prentice, there wasn't a violent jolt as portrayed in the film. It felt more like a car suddenly slamming on the brakes. Some passengers were even unaware that anything significant had happened. Many simply continued their evening, with some even sleeping through the entire collision. In fact, curious about the incident, Prentice left his cabin and ventured out onto the deck. What he saw was far from the dramatic scene shown in the movie. There was no towering iceberg looming nearby. Instead, he saw only a bit of ice, scattered on the deck, and the night was eerily quiet. But beneath the surface of the water, hidden from view, the iceberg had inflicted catastrophic damage to Titanic's hull. A jagged spur of ice had torn a massive 300-foot gash below the waterline. Once the crew realized the full extent of the damage, distress signals were sent to nearby ships. One significant difference from the movie is that the film suggests there was only one ship, the RMS Carpathia, close enough to respond to Titanic's call for help. In reality, there were other ships nearby, including the SS Californian, which was only about 20 miles away. Some believe that the Californian may have even seen Titanic's distress rockets lighting up the night sky. Yet, for reasons that remain a mystery to this day, the Californian did not come to the Titanic's aid. When it became clear that the Titanic was sinking, lifeboats were prepared and lowered into the freezing waters. The first lifeboat was launched at 12:45 a.m., as the crew began evacuating women and children first. This part is consistent with the movie, where women and children are shown boarding lifeboats while men stand by in grim resignation. However, real-life accounts paint a more complicated picture. Many women were hesitant to board the lifeboats, fearing the 70-foot drop from the deck to the ocean below. Moreover, many passengers didn't believe that the Titanic, the so-called unsinkable ship, would actually sink. This widespread disbelief led to hesitation and confusion. Survivor Frank Prentice recalled that passengers simply couldn't fathom that the ship was in real danger, which may explain why many initially refused to leave the Titanic. This mindset also contributed to why some lifeboats left the ship partially empty. For instance, Lifeboat number 7 was launched with only 27 people on board, even though it had the capacity to hold 65. The gravity of the situation wasn't fully understood by many passengers until it was too late. With over 2,200 people on board that night and only enough lifeboats for roughly half, a more efficient use of those boats could have made a significant difference. Yet at the time, many simply didn't grasp how urgent the situation was. As the evacuation slowly began, musicians from the ship's orchestra gathered on deck to play music in an effort to calm the passengers. This is a well-known part of Titanic's story, and it's one of the most poignant scenes in the movie. But the real story is a bit more nuanced. Some survivors later reported that they never saw or heard the musicians at all. Does that mean the band didn't play? Not at all. The musicians did play for over 2 hours after the ship hit the iceberg, but it's possible that in the chaos, many people simply didn't notice. The panic, the confusion, and the sheer terror of the moment may have drowned out the calming tunes. The treatment of third-class passengers has also been widely debated. In the movie, we see third-class passengers locked below deck, denied the same chance to escape as those in first and second class. The film portrays the crew as cruel and indifferent, essentially leaving the less fortunate to their fate. However, official inquiries into the disaster suggest a more complex reality. It is true that fewer third-class passengers survived, but this wasn't entirely due to them being locked away. Many were reluctant to leave their cabins, perhaps not fully understanding the danger they were in. Additionally, their quarters were located at extreme ends of the ship, making it much harder for them to navigate to the upper decks in time. Survivor accounts tell different stories. For instance, Mrs. George Wobb, a Lebanese woman traveling in third class, recalled that when chaos erupted, some of the crew and first-class passengers helped her find her way to the lifeboats. Her story contradicts the image of selfishness and disregard depicted in the movie. As the Titanic began to sink, the situation grew even more desperate. The ship, initially sinking slowly, eventually gave way to catastrophic failure. Passengers reported hearing popping and cracking sounds as the bulkheads below gave in to the rising water. Some survivors mentioned a loud boom, possibly caused by the breaking of the ship's compartments. While some heard only a single explosion, others describe a series of smaller bursts. However, the one thing everyone could agree on was that by 2:18 a.m., the Titanic's lights flickered out, plunging the ship into complete darkness. As the bow sank deeper into the Atlantic, the stern of the ship rose higher out of the water. This put immense strain on the middle of the ship, ultimately causing it to break in two. In the movie, this moment is portrayed dramatically, with the ship almost standing upright before sinking into the ocean. However, in reality, the break likely occurred at a much lower angle, just below the waterline. Nevertheless, it was still steep enough that passengers began sliding into the freezing waters. It wasn't until the wreckage of the Titanic was discovered in 1985 that it was confirmed beyond doubt that the ship had broken in two. Up until that point, survivor testimonies had been conflicting. Some survivors, like first-class passenger Emily Ryerson, described the ship breaking apart as though it had been sliced with a knife. Others, however, insisted that the Titanic had sunk intact. The idea that such a powerful, unsinkable ship could break apart was simply too hard for many to believe at the time. Another aspect of the disaster that Hollywood glosses over is just how incredibly dark it was that night. Survivors described the scene as pitch black, with no moonlight to illuminate the chaos. It was as if they were trapped in a room with no light, where they could only make out vague shapes and shadows. Passengers in the lifeboats could barely see what was happening, and those who were close to the sinking ship were too focused on survival to observe the details of the wreck. The real horror of that night was not just the sinking itself, but the oppressive, disorienting darkness that engulfed everything. While movies and TV shows have attempted to depict the disaster, none have truly captured the terror of that absolute darkness. One TV series, Titanic, 2012, made an effort to portray the pitch-black nature of the event, but even that couldn't fully convey the chilling reality. At Waves Discovery, we strive to explore the full truth behind historical events, peeling back the layers of myth and cinematic embellishment. The sinking of the Titanic remains one of the most tragic and fascinating stories in maritime history, and while Hollywood gave us an unforgettable film, the real events were even more complex and harrowing than we've been shown. That's it for today. If this story piqued your curiosity, make sure to like and share the video. And don't forget to check out our other fascinating content right here on Waves Discovery.